talk with you a little bit to help you understand the circumstances by which this violent, savage, and tragic event occurred. On the afternoon and evening hours of October 28th, the day before the death of Mr. Leverett, the murder of Mr. Leverett, Justin Riley was working on his car at a friend's house. He had been having problems with his vehicle and had been spending most of the day tinkering with it. And around 10:30 in the evening, he gave up his work and decided to walk home. Daytona Highlands Estates is a small neighborhood. A lot of the people who have been living there for years know each other well. Many of them are friends. And so when Justin Riley walked past the house of Brian Leverett that evening, he wasn't just passing the house of a neighbor. He was passing the house of his best friend. Over the years, the two had shared a lot of good times. And on this particular evening, the two of them decided to share a few beers. They grabbed a 12-pack, they hopped in Brian Leverett's truck, and they drove to a wooded area back behind their neighborhood. Now, this is an area that's known by several names. And over the course of the trial, you're going to hear it referred to as Dry Lake, the Sand Pits, and probably even the Sugar Bowl. But whatever they called it, it's a place where local young people went to have a good time, get a little loose, and hang out with their friends. On this particular night, Justin Riley and Brian Leverett encountered two other people, Scott Searles and Kendra Walls. They were out at the Sand Pits celebrating their recent engagement. Since the time of this event back in 2011, they've broken up and their relationship has come all apart. But on this particular night, they were celebrating what was a very special event in their lives. This is significant because Scott Searles and Kendra Walls were the very good friends of Wayne Greenlaw, and they were driving the defendant's white Jeep Cherokee out at the Sand Pits. After a little while, Justin Riley, Brian Leverett, Scott Searles, and Kendra Walls were having such a good time that Scott Searles invited them back to a party at the defendant's house. When Scott and Kendra went out to the woods that night, they had already been drinking for hours with the two defendants, particularly Wayne. And so, when they went back to the house, they all resumed those activities. Now, throughout the course of this trial, you're going to recognize that many and probably all of these individuals had a difficult time recalling and precise details of the evening, things like time. They had all been drinking, and the more that they drank, the worse that it got. But by the best estimates, Justin Riley and Brian Leverett get back to the two defendants' house at sometime after midnight and probably closer to 2 a.m. When Justin Riley and Brian Leverett arrive, Scott Searles and Kendra Walls are nowhere to be seen. They've called and told the Greenlaws that these two people are coming over, but they haven't joined the party themselves. When Justin Riley and Brian Leverett knock on the door, they meet the brothers, they shake hands, they're invited to the home, and the four of them sit at the kitchen table, drinking, playing cards, and swapping stories. Sometime just before dawn, an argument breaks out among them. Wayne Greenlaw is a bit of a gun fanatic. Wayne Greenlaw has a lot of weapons and enjoys them. He has a small collection, and he was showing them off to his guests that evening. Because Brian Leverett had been drinking, he said some things that he shouldn't have. When shown Mr. Greenlaw's prized possessions, Brian Leverett told him that they weren't any good. He told him that they weren't any good for deer hunting, and it started an argument between the two men. The two of them ended up arguing over what really was who had the better deer hunting rifle. And tempers quickly flared. Ray Greenlaw wasn't in the bedroom for this conversation. Ray Greenlaw remained out in the kitchen. Ray Greenlaw is also a little bit hard of hearing, and he had been drinking that evening. When he heard his brother in the bedroom arguing with someone else about guns with raised voices, he got upset. Because of the argument that occurred, everyone thought it was best for Brian Lever and Justin Riley to leave. Even Brian Lever and Justin Riley. But they weren't leaving fast enough for the two defendants. And as Brian Leverett was leaving, he was still running his mouth over his shoulder at these two men. But mind you, he did leave. He and Justin Riley both left the defendant's house of their own volition, of their own free will. And the door was closed behind them. Not only was the door closed behind them, it was locked behind them. At this point in my statement, it's probably important to tell you that after the defendants were arrested, they spoke to investigators. And even though Brian Leverett never lived long enough to tell investigators his side of the story, we're able to piece together the events of the evening and the early morning hours based upon the statements of Justin Riley and both defendants. Yeah, the details are a little fuzzy. They had all been drinking. But what happens next is one of the key events that the state points to for premeditation. It's shockingly violent, and it's unbelievably brutal.
Subject to the characterization, Your Honor. Personal opinion.
The facts will show that this event was over. It was over. The door was locked, and the victims were outside. It was over. Until they reinitiated it. Because Brian Leverett had been running his mouth, and because these two people weren't leaving fast enough, they opened the door. And 3 steps from the door, Justin Riley got hit in the face by a beer bottle. He turns around, and the moment that he turns around, what does he see? But Ray Greenlaw emerging from the house with a machete over his head, swinging it down at Justin Riley's face. And the only thing that Justin Riley can do at that distance is put his arm up and try and protect his own life. The machete sliced through his arm, it went through the bones, and it left whatever was left of his hand hanging by flesh and skin. This is at 5:30 in the morning. What's normally a quiet neighborhood erupts in violence, chaos, yelling, fear, and pandemonium. Some of the neighbors are already up and awake. Some of the neighbors had been up and feeding their children. Some of the neighbors had been up early and celebrating Halloween from the night before. Remember, it's October 29th. It's a Friday night, and there's Halloween parties going on in the neighborhood. And so after this outbreak of unbelievable violence,
Again, Your Honor, Mrs. Dwight, personal opinion.
I'll overrule for the time being, but perhaps be a little bit more circumspect as to your adverbs.
okay. Some of the neighbors start to call 911. And we start to get reports from all around the neighborhood. This is an overhead map of a of Aspen Street as it runs along this route. Out here is Roosevelt, and Azalea comes to the back of the circle here to meet up with Aspen.
Let me just stop here for a second. Defense counsel agreed to the use of this demonstrative aid?
Yes, yes, we did, Your Honor.
Okay, and if you'd like, you can move to the other side of that bench to be able to see what he's pointing to and instructing the jury on.
For the purposes of the record, this is Exhibit 10. This
Okay.
has been marked by the state.
Thank you.
This is the neighborhood where these events take place. You'll notice it's a sleepy little neighborhood here in Daytona Beach. Small houses, small yards, no streetlights. The Greenlaws live here. Brian Leverett was killed here where the red driveway is. Machete attack occurs out in the front yard of the Greenlaw's house. And as the morning progresses and people start to wake up, people start to call 911. Nicole Robinson, Diane Towsley, Mary Ann Fitzgerald, Kirk Madison, Mary Cassell. As the violence spreads up the street, we start to get a play-by-play by all of the witnesses who have had a chance to perceive some of the events. Nicole Robinson's is probably the best. You'll have an opportunity to hear her 911 call. It lasts 20 minutes. She's sitting in her window, literally begging the police to get there and reporting what she has seen as it occurs. And as the violence progresses down the street, you'll hear from each of these individuals. You hear what they heard, what they saw. You'll also hear what the defendants did. And you'll hear about the victims screaming in pain, yelling for help, and repeatedly requesting that people call 911. Immediately after the machete incident that occurs in the front yard, Justin Riley and Brian Leverett run. They run west on Aspen and head towards the bend in the road. And Ray Greenlaw stands in the front yard in an orange windbreaker, pulls out a pistol, and fires 2 shots into the air. You'll hear Nicole Robinson report that about 2 minutes into the 911 call. And for the next 7 minutes, you'll hear that there are no other significant events at the defendant's house or anywhere along the street. Another point where this event was over. 7 minutes. She's right across the street looking at the defendants standing in their driveway, wandering in and out of their open front door, talking to their friends and acting casually. 7 minutes. At the 9-minute mark in the phone call, you're going to hear that Wayne Greenlaw emerged from the front door of the house, looking militaristic and carrying an assault rifle. And then he fired shots. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that that's the point where these 2 brothers go out into the darkness and start hunting Brian Leverett and Justin Riley. In these 7 minutes of silence, the 2 brothers decided that they were going to kill Justin Riley and Brian Leverett. Fueled by a deadly mixture of alcohol and anger, Wayne Greenlaw grabbed his Mini 14, gave his brother a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. And the reason that we know this is because Scott Searles came back to the house just after the machete attack. You'll hear in Nicole Robinson's 911 call that the white Jeep is there, that the headlights are on, and that there's a young man in a white t-shirt who is Scott Searles. Scott Searles went into the house with the two brothers while they were arming up. Scott Searles was there in the bedroom when they got the guns in the ammunition. They tried to give him a gun too, but he didn't want any part of this. And he was there when Wayne Greenlaw said that he wanted to go out and kill these guys. The two brothers got their guns, they filled their pockets with ammunition and magazines, and they headed out into the darkness to find these two victims. Once again, they have left the protection of their home in order to strike out and do harm to wounded and fleeing men. So what did happen to Justin Riley and Brian Leverett? While Nicole Robinson is reporting what's going on at their house, we have 7 minutes of dead air time as it relates to our two victims. And so let's talk about it. Justin Riley fled from the scene clutching his arm, losing copious amounts of blood. He ran from the front door or front yard of the two defendants' house and ran down the street with Brian Leverett. His friends live here, the Meadows. He's known them for years. And so what does he try to do? He tries to find refuge. He runs down the side of the house on the eastern side, banging on the windows, trying to wake someone up, trying to get inside, trying to get help. When the lights don't come on, he lays down in the palmettos in the backyard and hopes that he won't be discovered. While he's laying there in the darkness, he hears the brothers. He hears them approaching and talking about how they're going to blow his head off if they find him. Eventually, the lights come on at this house, and they're able to see him laying there in their backyard in a pool of blood. They assist him into the house. Actually, they come out first. And in the time that Justin Riley has been laying there praying for safe refuge, where has Brian Leverett gone? Brian Leverett has proceeded around the circle. You see, this is where Brian Leverett lives. He's lived there for several years. And believe it or not, this is the first night that he's ever met the Greenlaws. None of these men knew each other before they showed up at the door around 2 in the morning. None of them. And so Brian Leverett runs back to his house, and along the way, he passes right here. This house in the corner is having a Halloween party. And there are people out in the backyard who have heard the shots and heard the yelling coming down the street. They're starting to stand out in the front yard, and Brian Leverett runs right past a guy named Kirk Madison, who will testify here in this courtroom. And what he'll tell you is that Brian Leverett shouted at him, "They're trying to kill us. They tried to cut him in half. Call 911." And he ran inside his home. A few minutes later, he emerged with a shotgun and a flashlight, and he ran back in the direction of the Meadows house. As he did, he passed Kirk Madison and again asked him to call 911. When he responded to the Meadows, he went in through the backyard, through the chain link fence, to the area where Justin Riley had been seeking refuge, to the area where Justin Riley lay losing blood. When he got into the backyard, he made contact with Daniel Meadow, the kid who lives in the house. He was assisting Justin Riley into the home. Brian Leverett returned to that home to ensure the safety of a wounded friend and stood guard over his entry through the back door of the residence. After inside, Brian Leverett went out into the front of the house and stood by the carport, which is in line with the driveway. Out there, he had a conversation with Daniel Meadow. He let Danny Meadow know that they had been attacked and that he was willing to use deadly force in order to protect his friend. Brian Leverett stood there in the middle of the Meadows' front yard, 2 doors down from the defendant's house, having a conversation with Daniel Meadow and protecting his friend and waiting for the police to arrive. He stood there in the darkness, his flashlight shining out into the night and illuminating the path for these 2 brothers to follow. In their interviews, the defendants were repeatedly asked why they fired upon Brian Leverett, and neither one of them could provide a good reason. But both of them walked down the street that night, left their house, and walked 2 doors down, clearing the field with military precision until they found their prey and they opened fire. Make no mistake about it, the evidence will show that the defendants hunted Brian Leverett and Justin Riley, and that when they fired, they did so with the intent to kill. 26 shots rang out in the darkness that night. Nicole Robinson will tell you that it sounded like a machine gun. You'll hear her panic and fear in her voice on the 911 call. And you'll find out that police were on scene in 9 minutes. 9 minutes from the time of the call, police arrived into this neighborhood. But because shots had been fired, and because Scott Searles was fleeing from the residence of the Greenlaws, they had to spend their time apprehending him and protecting themselves. And so it took 22 minutes for them to finally get to the porch where the defendants were smoking a cigarette and calmly waiting, acting like nothing had happened. The evidence will show that police received a 911 call from every single house in the neighborhood where someone lived that morning, and that this event scared everyone. But the only house from which 911 was never called was the defendant's. Not before, when there was an argument. Not during the 7 minutes of silence. And not after, to report the discharge of the weapon or the death of this human being. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a clear case of murder. The only reason that we're having a trial is because the victim died with a shotgun in his hand. But I'll let you in on a secret. That gun was never fired. There was no shell located by the responding officers. They spent the day there in that carport. No shell was found. When the gun was located, there was still dust down the barrel of the shotgun. The investigator picked it up and looked to see if it had been recently fired. There was dust and debris in the barrels. Brian Leverett's hands were checked for gunshot residue. You'll hear the expert who did the examination. She'll tell you that there was no gunshot residue on his hands. The only thing that opposes the evidence that I've just told you is the statement of Justin Riley inside the house and the statement of Danny Meadow, who was fleeing for his life when the Greenlaw started shooting. He was outside too. The bullets were bouncing all around the carport as he dove back into his house. And he says, in fact both of them say, that shotgun was discharged. But at the time that they made that statement, at the time when they said that they heard the shotgun, They had no idea that Wayne was out, or that Ray was out there with his brother Wayne. They had no idea that there were two people firing. And what they'll tell you here in court, or what they're likely to tell you, is that when given the opportunity to reconsider the circumstances as to whether or not they heard a shotgun distinctly or just another weapon, they'll likely tell you that they just heard another weapon, and they can't be sure. Kirk Madison, who was standing right there on the corner, didn't hear it, didn't see it fired. And he had a bird's eye view of this yard right here. And if that's not enough, let me let you in on another secret. The defendants were interviewed extensively on this topic. They were asked over and over and over if Brian Leverett was armed. You'll have the opportunity to watch their interviews. You'll have the opportunity to hear exactly what they said. When asked over and over and over if Brian Leverett had a weapon, you'll hear them both say no. In fact, they'll say it 6 and 7 times. It wasn't until much, much, much later that these defendants even learned that the victim had a shotgun. And as far as they knew, they shot an unarmed man that night. You see, that's what matters. When asked to determine whether a person's acting in self-defense, you're going to have to examine what they were thinking at the time of the event, what they knew. As far as they expressed, Brian Leverett was unarmed. And to add one more circumstance to this already mounting pile of proof of premeditated murder, Brian Leverett was shot in the back as he was fleeing for the house. The rounds that killed Brian Leverett hit him as he ran for safety. Ladies and gentlemen, this thing was over. It was over several times. The defendants had the victims out of their home. They locked the door. It was over. Greenlaw hit Justin Riley with a machete and sent the two of them running into the night, afraid for their lives. It was over. There were 7 minutes of silence where the two defendants were safely inside their house. It was over. And the evidence is going to show that each time it was over, that the defendants re-emerged from their home, re-engaged the victims, and instigated the violence. The defendants were the aggressors here. They were in complete control of the situation. And when you take a look at the personal safety plan and home protection plan that Wayne Greenlaw and Ray Greenlaw had in place, you will find that it includes hunting their neighbors with machetes and semi-automatic weapons. We have a phrase for that kind of violence in this country, and it isn't self-defense. It isn't standing your ground. We call that murder. And at the conclusion of this trial, I'm going to ask you to find the defendants guilty of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder for Justin Riley, and shooting into a building for the 26 rounds that they fired into the Meadows home at 5:30 a.m. The 26 rounds that killed Brian Leverett in cold blood. Thank you. You want the...
Mr. Lawrence, you would be the first with the opening statement, correct?
I believe that.
It's mid-morning. I would like to just factor in a break now, or would you prefer to go before the break?
All right, go ahead.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take our mid-morning break. It will be a 20-minute recess. It's a little after 20 after, so we'll just give you till 10:45.